The smoke arrives before anything else, not the thick, choking kind, not yet. Just a thin thread of it, curling up from the bread ovens that line the bakeries of Via della Abbondanza, the bakeries of Via della Abbondanza, the long, sun-washed street that runs like a spine through the heart of Pompeii on an ordinary morning in the 1st century of the Common Era. The loaves have been baking since before the sky turned pink. By the time the city wakes, the bread is already warm, already waiting, already filling the street with a smell so ancient and so familiar that it should feel impossible. And yet, somehow, it doesn't. Settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, because this is a story that deserves your full stillness. Pompeii is awake now. She does not ease into her mornings. She arrives in them all at once, all noise and colour and urgent motion, a city that never quite learned to be quiet. Cart wheels grind against the deep ruts worn into the stone roads, ruts so perfectly preserved that if you saw them now, 2,000 years later, you would feel something crack open in your chest. The shock of realizing that someone drove down this road in a hurry once and left a mark and forgot about it and died. And the mark stayed. The streets are narrow and white in the early light. The fountains run. Somewhere a dog barks at nothing in particular. The city is small by the standards of Rome, and Pompeii knows it, but she carries herself like she doesn't. 20,000 people, give or take, pressed together inside walls that follow the natural curve of an ancient lava flow built on a shelf of hardened rock above the Bay of Naples. On a clear morning, and the mornings here are almost always clear, you can see the water from the higher streets, that great flat blue sheet of the Mediterranean lying still and enormous and indifferent in the distance. The mountain is behind you. It is always behind you, but nobody thinks about the mountain. What people think about on a morning like this is breakfast. The Thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of a street food counter, with their wide stone counters and ceramic vessels sunk into the masonry to keep the food warm, are already open, already busy, already thick with the particular democratic noise of a city eating together, men on their way to the forum, women stopping between errands, children darting between adult legs with an expertise born of long practice. The food is simple. Hot wine, slightly watered, olives in oil, lentil stew, flatbread with cheese. Nothing that would mean anything, except that it does. It means everything, in the way that only the most ordinary things can. This was the sound of a city that did not know it was beautiful, that did not know it was loved, that did not know it was about to become the most perfectly preserved ordinary place in all of human history. We know this because someone scratched it into the wall near the largest oven in his bakery on the Via della Abbondanza, in the casual, permanent way that people in Pompeii wrote everything, as though stone were just a slower kind of paper. The inscription doesn't tell us much else. It doesn't tell us if he was a tall man or a short one, if he had children, if he was kind to his apprentices or impatient with them before the morning rush. It tells us only his name and that his bakery existed and that someone thought his name was worth remembering. In the year 79, that was enough. In the year 79, Modestus was simply a man who made bread the way his father had probably made bread, the way his son might one day make bread, in a city where 81 bakeries fed 20,000 people every single day, without once thinking of themselves as remarkable. Adjust your pillow if you need to. We are going somewhere old and warm, and you should be comfortable. The bakeries of Pompeii are among the strangest and most tender things that archaeology has ever given us. When the excavators first reached them, centuries after the mountain had buried everything in silence, they found the ovens still stocked, the millstones still upright, the grain still in the grinding rooms, carbonized but present, still shaped like grain, still arranged in the hoppers as though someone had stepped away for a moment and simply never come back. And in at least one oven, in what may have been Modestus's own bakery, though no one can say for certain, there were 81 loaves of bread, round loaves divided into wedges the way Roman bread always was, stamped with the baker's mark before baking, so that customers who bought their bread wholesale could identify whose hands had made it. 81 loaves, still in the oven, still roughly in the shape of bread, though turned to black carbon by 2,000 years of geological pressure, though brittle enough to crumble at a touch. Still bread in every way that matters. There is a particular kind of grief that has no name in English, the grief you feel not for something lost, but for something interrupted, for a task that was almost finished, for a meal that was almost eaten. The bread in Modestus's oven was not abandoned. It was simply not yet done. The morning of the 24th of August had barely begun when the mountain changed its mind about everything, and so the bread sat and waited, and is waiting still in a glass case in the Archaeological Museum of Naples, the most patient loaves in the history of the world. But that morning, that last ordinary morning, the earlier batches had already come out perfect. Already sold, already torn apart by warm hands on cold streets, already feeding the dockworkers down at the port, already inside the bodies of cad children who were racing each other somewhere they weren't supposed to be. The bread existed and was eaten and became part of people who no longer exist, and this is the most ordinary miracle in the world, repeated 10,000 times a day in Pompeii, and no one noticed it once. This is the first thing you must understand about Pompeii. Before the mosaics, before the temples, before the haunting plaster casts of bodies frozen mid-gesture in the ash, before any of it, there are the walls. Thousands of inscriptions, scratched or painted onto the plastered surfaces of houses and shops and taverns and public buildings, covering the city like a second skin made entirely of human thought. Election notices, advertisements, declarations of love, insults so specific they could only have been aimed at one particular person on one particular street who definitely deserved it, jokes that still land, complaints that still sting, the handwriting of people who have been dead for 2,000 years, preserved with a clarity so startling that historians can sometimes identify individual scribes by the particular slant of their letters, the habitual flourish on a capital A, the way a certain hand always pressed a little too hard on the downstroke. Take a slow breath. What we are about to read was written by someone who has not existed for 20 centuries, and it will feel, somehow, like a text message. The Romans had a word for this kind of wall writing, graffiti, which simply meant scratched things, marked things, evidence of a hand that had been here, and the people of Pompeii scratched with a devotion that bordered on compulsion. A gladiator named Celadus was called, in looping letters near the amphitheatre, the one who made women sigh, written not by Celadus himself, one imagines, but by some devoted admirer who felt the feeling so urgently they could not wait to find a better surface. Nearby, someone else had scratched a correction, or perhaps a rival opinion, though time has been unkind to the exact wording. The conversation continues, or rather, it stopped mid-sentence, the way all conversations in Pompeii eventually did. There are love declarations of such naked vulnerability that reading them now produces a particular ache. Restituta, take off your tunic, please, and show me your tricks. Crude, certainly, but also unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate, the writing of someone who felt something so strongly in a particular moment that only stone would do. There are also the tender ones. I have spoken with you, and now, having spoken, I don't want to leave. That one was found near a doorway, carved carefully, the letters even and deliberate, the work of someone who was in no hurry, because they were trying to make something last, trying in the only way available to them to stop time. And then there are the ones that arrive like small cold stones dropped into warm water. Gaius Pumidius Diphilus was here, scratched on the wall of a house near the Forum, with a date, the 3rd of October in a year now lost. He was here. He wanted someone to know it. He did not know that his small insistence on existing would outlast him by 21 centuries. That people who spoke a language he could not have imagined would one day stand in front of his words and feel, without quite being able to explain it, that they had been personally addressed. Gaius Pomidius Diphilus was here, and so, once were all of them, the lovers and the bakers and the gladiator fans, the election campaigners and the election campaigners and the bored children who drew ships on the walls near the harbour, the unknown person who wrote simply, in large letters, "Near the entrance to a tavern, I wonder, wall, that you have not collapsed and fallen, since you bear the weight of so many tedious inscription." Even the walls had enough, eventually, but they held long enough. And somewhere among the thousands of names and declarations and opinions and jokes, scratched forever into the plaster of a city that was already living its last days without knowing it, there is a name no one has found yet, a woman perhaps, or a child, who had something very important to say, and said it quietly, in a small corner, and is still waiting to be read. He ordered them the way a man orders something he has ordered 100 times before, without looking up, without pausing in the middle of whatever he was already thinking about. One hand already reaching for the small ceramic cup of watered wine that Iris, the woman who ran the counter on the corner of the Via di Nola, had already poured because she knew. She always knew. This is the particular intimacy of a regular customer and the person who feeds them, a relationship so small it has no name, and yet so reliable it becomes, over time, a kind of love, not the loud kind, the kind that lives in the gesture of a cup already poured, the kind that asks nothing and expects nothing, and is simply, quietly, there every morning like the light. The thermopolium where Marcus ate his breakfast, where a great many people ate their breakfast and their lunch, and sometimes their dinner, was one of at least 89 such establishments in Pompeii. 89. In a city of 20,000 people, which means that on any given morning, the streets of Pompeii were lined with the smell of hot food in a way that would have been, to a modern nose arriving without warning, almost overwhelming. Wine warming in terracotta, oil heating in shallow pans, onions softening, chickpeas thickening in their broth, the particular herby, slightly smoky smell of garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything, with an enthusiasm that Istavri has never quite forgiven them for, and which food historians now quietly acknowledge was probably delicious. The thermopolium itself was a modest thing, as most of them were, a stone counter, as most of them were. A stone counter, built out from the front of the building, with wide circular holes cut into its surface to hold the large ceramic storage vessels called dolia, sunk in flush with the counter, so that the food inside them stayed warm. The way a modern bain-marie works, the way every food service solution eventually works once someone smart enough has thought about it long enough. The counter was painted as most counters were. Bright colours, deep red, warm yellow, and in some of the more prosperous establishments, small painted scenes of the food on offer, a kind of ancient menu displayed directly on the architecture. Peacock, duck, garlands of vegetables, a chicken looking resigned to its fate. Iris had run this counter for 11 years. She had inherited it from her former owner when he died. She had been enslaved, then freed, then left the business in a city that offered, to a woman of her particular combination of competence and determination, more opportunity than Rome proper might have. She knew her suppliers by name. She knew which olive oil was worth the price, and which was not. She knew that the man who sold her chickpeas from a cart every Tuesday had been slowly reducing his portions for 3 months, and she had been slowly reducing his payment for 3 months, and neither of them had said a word about it, because the negotiation was more interesting than the resolution, and also they had been doing this for years, and it was practically a friendship. She watched Marcus eat his lentils without tasting them, staring at some middle distance over the rim of his cup, thinking about something she would never know. He was a freedman. She knew that much. She could tell by the ring he wore. The particular quality of his wool, the way he carried himself with the slightly careful dignity of someone who had worked hard to occupy space and intended to keep doing it. He came every morning. He left a fair tip. He had never once told her his name, and she had never asked, because some regularities are more comfortable when they stay unnamed. Around them the street performed its mourning. A teacher led a small group of boys past in a cluster, their wax tablets tucked under their arms, their sandals slapping the stone in cheerful disorder. 2 women stopped nearby to continue an argument that had clearly been going on for several days and showed no signs of resolution. A cart loaded with amphorae swayed around the corner, the driver exchanging a complicated series of gestures with someone in an upstairs window that seemed to communicate both a greeting and an ongoing grievance. A cat sat on a warm wall and regarded all of it with the permanent, luminous indifference of cats everywhere and always. Marcus finished his lentils, placed his cup back on the counter with the small, deliberate click of a man returning a thing to its proper place, nodded once at Iris, who nodded back, because this was the entire transaction, and it was sufficient. He walked back into the street and was gone. One thread dissolving back into the fabric of a morning that would continue without him, the way all mornings do. Blue ones do. Blue ones cut that morning from the small garden at the back of the house, where the planting beds ran in neat geometric rows between the columns of the peristyle and the fountain that someone's grandfather had installed in better financial times and that still worked, mostly, when the city's water pressure was cooperative. Julia Felix, for that was her name, and she deserves to be called by it, had arranged them herself in a wide ceramic bowl near the impluvium, the hollow rectangular pool at the centre of the atrium that caught rainwater and light in equal measure and gave the whole front of the house a particular quality of stillness, as though the air itself had decided to slow down here and stay for a while. She was not a woman who arranged flowers because she was expected to. She arranged them because she liked the specific task of it, the choosing, the trimming, the small considered decisions about height and angle that no one would ever notice and that she noticed completely. This is a thing about Julia Felix that the historical record captures only in outline, but that the outline implies clearly enough. She was a woman who paid attention to her property, to her tenants, to the details of a life that was by the standards of her city and her time, unusually self-determined, settle in. She is worth knowing Julia Felix owned one of the largest private properties in Pompeii. The estate that bore her name, the Pradia di Giulia Felice, running along the Via dell'Abbondanza, contained a private bathhouse, a garden, a tavern, fruit orchards, and a series of rental apartments, all of which she managed herself, or oversaw the management of, with a practicality that the stone record preserves in the form of a rental advertisement so specific and businesslike it could have been posted yesterday. She offered the use of an elegant bath, shops with attached apartments and upper-floor lodgings to let for a period of 5 years. The advertisement specifies the lease length. It specifies the amenities. It does not apologize for itself or soften its language into anything more feminine than the facts. She was not married as far as anyone can determine. She had no visible husband. She had no visible husband. In a city and a century where women's legal existence was largely defined by their relationship to a father or a spouse, Julia Felix had somehow arranged herself outside those definitions through inheritance, through competence, through whatever combination of circumstance, and will have left her in possession of a significant piece of Pompeian real estate and the freedom to run it as she saw fit. The historians are careful about this. They say we cannot be certain. They are right, but the advertisement is there in stone, in her name, and the name means happy Julia, lucky Julia, who has what she needs. Her house had a garden that her tenants could walk in for an additional fee. The garden was beautiful. We know this from the paintings that once decorated the outdoor dining room. Long, luminous frescoes of garden scenes, birds perched in fruit trees, fountains surrounded by flowering plants, the whole painted world spilling along the walls as though the real garden outside were not quite enough. As though beauty could be expanded indefinitely, simply by painting more of it. Someone who lived inside these walls, or who commissioned these walls, believed that a garden should surround you completely, should fold you in, should make you feel wherever you stood that you were at the center of something growing. Julia moved through her house the way people move through spaces they have shaped entirely to themselves. Without ceremony, without performance, following the particular private geography of a life lived mostly inward. She checked the rental rooms with the brisk attention of someone who has learned that small problems become large problems with remarkable speed if you stop looking. She spoke with her household staff in the courtyard, reviewing the day's requirements. She sat for a while in the garden, in the particular morning light that fell between the columns at that hour, and nowhere else, doing nothing that anyone would have thought worth recording. She was simply living, carefully, completely, on her owl. In terms inside walls, she owned, beneath a mountain she never thought about. The larkspur stood in their bowl by the water. He had been late since the moment he woke, which was later than he was supposed to wake, which was itself a consequence of having stayed up past dark the previous night, watching the men play dice outside the tavern on his street, not gambling himself, not yet, but observing with the intense scholarly focus of a boy who has identified something interesting about the adult world and intends to understand it completely before deciding whether to disapprove of it. His mother had said nothing when he finally came inside. This was worse than if she had said something. He had lain awake for a while in the particular discomfort of anticipated consequences, and then he had fallen asleep. And now he was late, and his sandal strap had broken on the third stepping stone across the Via della Bedanza, the tall stone islands that let pedestrians cross the street without stepping in, whatever the street happened to contain that morning, which was considerable. He stopped on the stepping stone, one sandal on and one sandal in his hand, and weighed his options with the rapid, pragmatic calculation of a child who has been in this situation before. Ahead of him, the street sloped upward toward the Forum, and beyond it, the house of the teacher who was expecting him. Behind him, the street sloped back toward home, and the certain knowledge that returning for a new sandal would make him later still, and also would involve his mother. Above him, on a second-floor balcony, an old man was watching him with the unhurried interest of someone who has nowhere to be and finds the difficulties of the young quietly entertaining. Lucius tied the broken strap in a knot, tested it with his weight, found it acceptable, and ran. This is the thing about children in Pompeii, that the archaeology captures in small, glancing ways that are somehow more affecting than the grand monuments. They were everywhere. They scratched drawings into walls at the height of a child's reach, drawings of ships and horses and gladiators and geometric patterns that may have meant something specific or may have meant nothing at all, except the pure pleasure of making a mark. They played with carved wooden toys, with small clay figures, with the knuckle bones of sheep that served as a kind of ancient jacks, tossed and caught with a skill that required practice and therefore implied hours of dedicated, purposeful play in some sunny corner of some courtyard. Tiny handprints pressed into wet plaster by someone who wanted to leave a mark and had nothing to write with. Small footprints in the clay of a building site, made by a child who had walked through before the material hardened and had never known they were signing their name to the century. The streets belonged to the children in a way that they did not quite belong to anyone else. The adults moved through Pompeii with intention, toward the Forum, toward the bathhouse, toward the market, toward the particular errand that gave the journey its shape. The children moved differently. They moved with the fluid, associative logic of people who are not yet going anywhere specific and have not yet been convinced that this is a problem. They found things. A broken amphora handle that was the right weight for throwing. A puddle left by the morning's water delivery that was the right depth for something not yet determined. A cat that might, with sufficient patience and the correct offering of a small piece of bread, consent to be held. Lucius ran past all of it without stopping, which cost him something, because there was a dog near the bakery that he knew, a large, affable brown dog of no particular breed who accepted ear scratch. As his natural due, and today Lucius did not have time to stop, and he felt this as a small, genuine loss, the kind that children feel more honestly than adults do because they have not yet learned to file small sadnesses away under the heading of unavoidable. He would stop on the way back. He decided this firmly, as a promise to himself and to the dog, and the decision made the running easier. The city rose around him as he ran, the painted walls, the fountains, the smell of bread still warm from Modestus's oven, the sound of the Forum beginning its daily business somewhere ahead, the mountains standing blue and enormous and utterly silent against the morning sky behind everything. So familiar it had become invisible, the way all permanent things eventually do. He was going to be so late, he ran faster, and his broken sandal held, and somewhere behind him the brown dog watched him go with the patient. Forgiving attention of dogs who understand that people are always in a hurry and that this is their tragedy and not yours, not the grand offerings. Miss Nistis, not yours. Not the grand offerings, not the official sacrifices performed by the priests at the temple of Jupiter that dominated the northern end of the forum, where the mountain watched from across the rooftops with its permanent blue silence, and the priests moved in their white wool with the deliberate choreography of men who understood that ritual was not about the gods so much as it was about the people watching. Those would come later, with their smoke and their ceremony and their civic weight. What began in the early morning in the streets and the doorways and the small tiled niches built into the walls of almost every home and shop and tavern in the city was quieter than that, more private, more genuinely felt, perhaps precisely because no one was watching. Pompeii believed in everything. This is not quite accurate, but it is closer to the truth and the alternative. The Romans were not a people with a single faith and a single god demanding exclusive devotion. They were a people with an appetite for the divine that was, in its own way, as generous and indiscriminate as their appetite for olive oil and garum and the spectacle of the amphitheatre. They collected gods the way a harbour collects ships, welcoming whatever arrived from whatever direction, finding room, making accommodations, Jupiter and Juno and Minerva in the great temple at the forum's head, Venus, the patron goddess of Pompeii herself, whose temple stood on the southwestern edge of the city, and who was understood to have a particular personal interest in the city's well-being, a relationship so intimate it was almost neighborly. Isis, the Egyptian goddess, whose temple in Pompeii was one of the best preserved in the entire Roman world, evidence of a devoted and active community of worshippers who had brought her across the Mediterranean and made her a Pompeian as thoroughly as anyone born within the city walls. And then the smaller ones, the ones that lived not in temples but in the street. The Lauraria, the household shrines, were everywhere in Pompeii, and they are among the most quietly moving things the city contains. Built into the walls of atria, painted above doorways, tucked into corners of kitchens and workshops, they held small painted or sculpted figures of the Lares, the household gods, the divine presences understood to protect a specific family in a specific place. Every morning, in homes across the city, someone paused in front of the household shrine and left something. A small cake, a few drops of wine, a garland of flowers woven from whatever the garden was producing that week. The gesture was brief. It was habitual. It was, in the way that all deeply habitual things eventually become, sincere precisely because it asked so little. And expected in return only the ordinary continuation of ordinary life. A woman named Fortunata, her name painted above the shrine in her employer's kitchen, suggesting she was the one primarily responsible for its maintenance, left a small oil lamp burning every morning before the household woke. Not because anyone told her to, because she had done it for so long that the day felt wrong without it, felt unguarded, felt like walking outside without checking first that the door was properly closed. The flame was very small. It lit almost nothing. But it was there, and it was hers, and it said, in the only language available to it, that she was here too, that she was paying attention, that she was asking, in the most modest possible way, for things to continue. In the streets, the gods multiplied. Small shrines at crossroads, at the entrances to neighborhoods, at the corners where two busy streets met and the foot traffic was heaviest, as though the divine presence were most needed precisely where the human chaos was most concentrated. Travelers stopped, workers passed by with a nod, a murmured word, a gesture so brief and automatic it barely registered as religious, and yet was somehow more religious for that. The faith worn smooth by daily use into something indistinguishable from breathing. The temple of Isis drew her followers in the morning light, people who had come from across the Mediterranean world and found in her worship something the Roman pantheon did not quite offer, a tenderness, an intimacy, a goddess who had herself suffered and searched and mourned. who understood what it was to lose something and keep looking anyway. They gathered in the temple's courtyard, which was painted in vivid colors that still hold something of their original intensity, and performed their morning rituals with the focused attention of people who were not performing for an yom but themselves and their goddess, who they believed was listening. She may have been. No one can say for certain. What can be said is that the city was full of people asking, in 100 different languages and gestures and small quiet ceremonies, for the same essential things: health, safety, a good harvest, a business that did not fail, a child who recovered from the fever, a husband who came home, a day that ended the way it began, ordinary, warm, sufficient, alive. The gods of Pompeii received 10,000 small requests on the morning of the 24th of August. This is what August does in Campania. It presses the light down flat against everything, removes all softness from the hour, turns the white stone streets into something that holds heat the way a hand holds a stone taken from a fire. The fountain basins were warm to the touch by noon. The stepping stones across the Via dell'Abbondanza radiated upward. Even the shade beneath the colonnaded walkways that lined the Forum offered only a partial reprieve, a suggestion of coolness rather than the thing itself. And the people who stood in it stood close to the columns and were grateful for suggestions. The city had shifted its rhythm, the way Mediterranean cities have always shifted in the deep heat of the afternoon, with the particular collective intelligence of people who have lived a long time in a hot place and understand the afternoon is not for fighting. The Forum, busy since dawn with merchants and magistrates, and the general productive noise of civic life, had thinned. The courts had paused. The larger shops had drawn their wooden shutters halfway, not closed exactly, but resting the way an eye rests when it is not quite asleep. The bathhouses, conversely, were filling. The afternoon was the bathhouse hour, the time when the city migrated toward warm water and cool marble and the very sesh, pacific pleasure of being clean in a place built entirely around the concept of being clean. Pompeii had at least 3 major public baths, and they were not merely functional. They were social, they were architectural. They were architectural. They were, in many ways, the truest expression of what Roman civilization believed about itself, that the body deserved attention and warmth, that cleanliness was not a private matter, but a civic one, that the act of bathing together, in rooms of increasing heat moving from the frigidarium to the tepidarium to the caldarium, was a form of participation in the city itself. Men and women bathed in separate sections or at separate hours, but the experience was otherwise as communal as the Forum, as democratic as the Thermopolium counter, everyone arriving with their own oil flask and strigil, the curved metal scraper used in lieu of soap, and leaving, eventually, with the particular loose-limbed contentment of a body that has been properly attended to. A man named Titus Flavius was having an argument in the tepidarium, not a loud argument. The baths discouraged loud arguments, and also Titus was not a loud man. He was a soft-spoken, moderately prosperous wool merchant who had opinions about the upcoming municipal elections that he held with a conviction inversely proportional to how much any of it actually affected him. The man he was arguing with, his friend Aulus, a tanner whose professional smell even the baths could not entirely neutralize, disagreed with equal conviction and equal irrelevance to the actual outcome. They had been having this argument in various forms for approximately 15 years. Neither of them had ever changed the other's mind about anything. This had never once reduced the pleasure of the argument. Outside, the afternoon continued its slow, heavy business. A woman sat on a stone bench near the temple of Apollo and Rhea, read a sandal strap with the focused attention of someone doing a simple thing well, which is its own kind of meditation. 2 elderly men played a board game in the shade of a colonnade, moving their pieces with the deliberate lack of urgency of people who have understood that speed is a young person's error. A child slept in the shadow of a doorway, one arm thrown over a dog, both of them motionless in the heat, both of them dreaming whatever dogs and children dream on warm afternoons in cities that are still standing. The light through the atrium of Julia Felix's house fell at its particular afternoon angle, illuminating a column of floating dust that moved in slow spirals whenever anyone walked through the room. The bread from Modestus's morning batches had all been eaten. The walls held their thousands of inscriptions, patient and permanent. The larkspur in the bowl by the impluvium had begun very slightly to droop the way flowers do in the afternoon heat, not dying, just resting, just waiting for the evening cool to lift them back toward themselves. The mountain had not moved. It had not made a sound. It offered nothing to the afternoon except its enormous familiar shape against the sky, a shape so constant, so present, so thoroughly woven into the visual grammar of every single person who had ever lived in this city, that it had long since stopped being something they saw and had become, instead, simply part of what seeing meant here, in this place, on this particular afternoon. The dust moved in its slow column through Julia's atrium. Titus and Aulus disagreed warmly about the elections. The child and the dog slept on, and the afternoon held everything in its flat, golden, absolute light. Held it the way you hold something you do not know you are about to drop, loosely, without thinking, because you have never dropped it before. Small, plain, the kind of ring that meant something specific to the person who wore it and nothing at all to anyone else. No inscription, no gemstone, no heraldic device that might tell a story to a stranger. Just a band, worn smooth on the inside from years of contact with the same finger, left on a table or a shelf, or dropped in the courtyard and not yet found, or carried in a pocket, if Romans had pockets, which they largely did not, which meant that small precious things were held in the hand or tucked in the fold of a garment, or simply worn, kept close, kept on the body, which is its own kind of keeping. The ring was found centuries later in the ash, separated from whatever hand had worn it, lying in the hardened grey, nothing like a small, quiet question. Who wore it? We don't know. We will never know. And this not knowing is itself a kind of knowledge. It tells us that someone lived here who had something worth keeping, and that the keeping and the losing happened so close together that history could not fit a name between them. Pompeii is full of things like this. The excavations that began in earnest in the 18th century, and that continue still, have produced an inventory of the ordinary that has no parallel anywhere in the ancient world. Not treasures, mostly, though there are treasures. Not monuments, mostly, though there are those too. What Pompeii has given us, in its most generous and most devastating abundance, is the residue of interrupted life. A loaf of bread, a set of surgical instruments, still in their wooden case, the bronze handles worn in the exact places that a specific pair of hands had held them for years, a child's toy, a small terracotta pig with a slot in its back for coins, found near the doorway of a house on the Via dell'Abbondanza, in a position that suggested it had been placed there deliberately, set down with care, as though someone intended to ret. Earn for it, a gladiator's helmet polished to a shine that the ash preserved so perfectly that when it was uncovered it caught the excavator's lantern light and reflected it back. A woman's jewelry box, still containing her rings and earrings and the small bronze mirror in which she had last seen her own face. A wooden cradle, carbonized to black but structurally intact, still shaped like a cradle, still shaped like the idea of a child being rocked, still shaped like the particular hope that small wooden things represent when they are built carefully for the purpose of holding something fragile and beloved. Take a breath. These things are 2,000 years old, and they still know what they were for. There is a wall in the garden of a house near the central baths where someone, at some point in the last years of Pompeii's life, painted a still life above the garden entrance, not a mythological scene, not a portrait, not a civic commemoration, just objects. A glass bowl of fruit, a ceramic jug, a dead bird hung by its feet in the way that game was displayed in wealthy houses, its feathers still rendered in careful, loving detail. The painting has no narrative. It does not tell a story. It simply says, these things existed. They were here, they were beautiful in their ordinary way, and someone thought that beauty was worth the time it took to preserve it on a wall. This is what Pompeii returns to us. Finally, when all the grand analysis has been done, not history in the sense of events and consequences, but history in the sense of presence, the proof that people stood here, braved here, were bored and hungry and in love and irritable and generous and frightened and hopeful here. The ring on the shelf and the bread in the oven and the name scratched into the plaster and the toy pig by the door are not artifacts in the cold museum sense of the word. They are the last. Gestures of people who did not know they were making last gestures, who put things down with the absolute ordinary confidence of those who fully expected to pick them back up. A set of keys was found near the threshold of a house in the Reggio 6, a substantial iron ring holding several keys of different sizes, the kind of key ring that belongs to someone responsible for multiple locks, multiple rooms, multiple secured portions of a life. It was found close to the door, in the position a keyring occupies when someone has just come home or is just about to leave, the ambiguity of the threshold captured perfectly in the ambiguity of the object's location. Coming or going, arriving or departing, staying or leaving, forever undecided, forever suspended in the grey ash of an ordinary morning that became something no one had a name for yet. The keys are in a museum now, behind glass, in a room with climate control and careful lighting. Somewhere in the same room, the ring is also waiting. The day began the way all the others had. There is no kinder way to say this, and no crueler one. The 24th of August in the year 79 of the Common Era arrived in Pompeii, the way every morning arrived, with light, with warmth, with the sounds of a city that did not know how to be quiet, pulling itself back into motion. After the brief pause of night, the fountains ran, the bakeries opened. Somewhere on the Via dell'Abbondanza, a cartwheel found the deep rut it had found 1,000 times before, and settled into it with the comfortable inevitability of a thing returning to its proper place. The mountain stood against the early sky exactly where it had always stood, blue and enormous and patient in the way that only geological things can be patient. The patience of something that has been waiting so long, it has forgotten that waiting is what it is doing. Modestus was at his oven bee. For the sun cleared the city walls. The dough had proved overnight, and it was good. He would have known this the moment he touched it, the particular give and resistance of dough that has done what dough is supposed to do, transformed in the dark from something inert into something almost alive, full of the quiet industry of yeast that asks for nothing except warmth and time, and returns for this modest investment the staff of life itself. He shaped the loaves with the automatic competence of a man who has made the same thing 10,000 times and whose hands know the work better than his mind does. Round, divided into wedges, stamped with his mark, slid into the oven on the long wooden peel, the way they always were, the way they always would be. He did not know they would never come out. Lucius woke late again, and his mother said nothing again, and his mother said nothing again, and he ran through the streets with his sandals intact this time, past the brown dog, who received a brief ear scratch that was better than nothing, past the thermopolium, where Iris was already at her counter, past the shrine on the corner where someone had left fresh flowers that morning. Larkspur, blue, slightly wilted already in the gathering heat. He ran the way. Children run when they are late. Children run when they are late. Which is to say, with the pure, uncomplicated physicality of a body that does not yet know all the things it has to worry about. Every stride a small declaration of being alive and moving, and here. Julia Felix walked in her garden in the early light before the heat made it unpleasant. The larkspur in the bowl inside had been replaced. Fresh ones, cut from the back beds, standing upright in their water with the cheerful resilience of flowers that have not yet had time to know they are cut. She noted a crack in the plaster of the eastern colonnade that had appeared sometime in the night, the consequence of tremors there that had been occurring intermittently for days, small shudders in the earth that the people of Pompeii had learned, after the great earthquake of 17 years before, to monitor with a watchful unease that never quite hardened into alarm. The earth moved sometimes here, It always had. The buildings were repaired, and life continued, and the mountain watched and said nothing. Titus Flavius had an opinion about the crack in the plaster that he shared with Aulus when they met near the Forum that morning. Aulus had a different opinion. They walked together toward the baths, disagreeing companionably, their sandals on the warm stone, their voices rising and falling in the particular music of a conversation between two people who enjoy each other's company more than they enjoy being right, though neither of them would ever have admitted this out loud. Fortunata lit the lamp at the household shrine before anyone else was awake, the way she always did, the flame very small, the gesture very old, the morning very ordinary in every way, that mornings had ever been ordinary here, that mornings had ever been ordinary here, in this place, in this light, under this sky, and then, somewhere between the 9th and 10th hour, somewhere in the warm, heavy, golden late morning, while the bread was still baking, and the children were still running, and the walls still held their thousands of patient inscriptions, and the ring was still on someone's finger, and the keys were still on their ring, and the toys were still being played with by hands that were still warm, the mountain exhaled, not with warning, not with the courtesy of a dramatic build-up, not with the courtesy of a dramatic build-up, not with the theatrical rumble that the stories always imagine, just a sound first. A sound that no one who heard it had a word for, a sound from outside the vocabulary of everything they had ever experienced, a sound that arrived in the body before it arrived in the mind, and then the sky above Vesuvius opened into something that the Roman writer Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay, would later describe in a letter to the historian Tacitus with the careful precision of a man trying to explain something that language had not been built to contain. A cloud, he said, rising in the shape of a pine tree, spreading at the top, the trunk pushing upward with tremendous force, the branches spreading wide and dark against the blue. Modestus's bread was still in the oven. Lucius was still running somewhere in the warm stone streets, his sandals striking the cobbles in their quick percussion, his breath coming fast, his whole young body aimed forward into the morning that was opening ahead of him, the way all mornings open, with the complete, luminous, unrepeatable promise of a day not yet spent. The fountains ran for a little while longer. Then the ash began to fall, soft at first, like the most terrible snow, soft at first, like the most terrible snow, drifting down through the altered air onto the upturned faces of 20,000 people who stood very still for one long, suspended, golden moment, looking up at something they had never seen before and would never see again, not understanding yet, not fully, the way you never fully understand the last ordinary thing until it is already gone. The bread was almost done, the city was still warm, and somewhere on a wall that would stand for 2,000 years, in letters carved by a hand that had pressed just a little too hard on the downstroke, someone had written a name, just one person insisting quietly on having existed, and the ash came down, and the name stayed still.